This is the Web Platform Podcast, episode number 103, Articulating Design Decisions. Thanks, everybody, for joining in with us this week. I'm your host, Danny Blue, and with me is Amel Hussein.
Hi, everyone.
And this week we have, again, we've talked about our super special guests that we always have. This week it is Tom Griever.
Hey, you guys. Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Thank you very, very much for coming on. It was a little bit short notice, so we're really happy that we got it all worked out. Technical problems got handled at the beginning, so hopefully that's all we'll have. So, real quick, can you give us a little bit of an introduction to you? Who is Tom Griever?
Well, that sounds like a very existential question, but I am the UX director at Bitovi. We are a front-end design and development shop. We build and maintain a number of open-source JavaScript frameworks for front-end development. In fact, we had the very first MVC framework for JavaScript way back in the day. It was called JavaScript MVC, and now a lot of the parts and pieces of JavaScript MVC have been kind of abstracted into their own projects, CanJS and Done.js, and we have dependency management and documentation and kind of all these different tools that we use because we're a consulting company, and we use all of these on our own client project. That's what I'm doing now. And I wrote a book called Articulating Design Decisions, which is the topic and the title of today's broadcast.
It absolutely is. So first off, I think a lot of the things we'll probably talk about will really resonate with anybody that's had to work in a in a larger company, but I think especially in a consulting company. I worked for a consulting company for many years. Several years, we'll say. So I think a lot of the things we'll cover will resonate well with that. So first off, so we know a little bit about what individual words that I can string into.
No, this is great. You're just setting us up to talk about how to articulate yourself.
It's a before and after.
No, it is perfect.
I just assumed you did that on purpose. You were trying to demonstrate the before and after effect of having discussed this topic.
Oh, I love it. I'm going to be so eloquent by the end of this. See, now I just have to prepare myself for the end.
Yeah.
Awesome. So can you talk about your background just a little bit? So specifically, I'd like to know pretty much how you got up to writing your book, and exactly what articulating design decisions means. How did that become the title, and what led you to want to write that book?
Yeah, well, so I've always been a designer in one form or another throughout my career. I actually started out in business. My undergrad degree is in marketing, and I started out in a marketing department, really more as a business person. But because I was skilled in design, you sort of get roped into these opportunities to create designs for people that need a designer, and everyone needs a designer on their project, right? And so you kind of fall into some of those roles just naturally. But I was doing it at a time when the web was still pretty new and was changing significantly, and people were realizing that they could do more than just kind of have these brochures online, that they could do more than just kind of communicate a message, but they could actually create products with it. And so one of my first jobs after I graduated from college was with a company that did electronic payment services, and they were for the very first time moving from kind of this old school green screen terminal rental model to, hey, we could actually build this as a web application, and it would be significantly cheaper, and anyone could access it from any computer, and we wouldn't have to have these huge terminals anymore. And so I was a part of a project back then that was felt really groundbreaking at the time, and looking back on it, it felt so terrible because we didn't do much to the interface to change it really. We just kind of took this green screen-esque terminal interface and kind of just translated that into what was essentially an HTML form, right? But it was amazing that you could access the data and click submit, and it would save it to the system all through a regular internet connection. That was kind of a new thing. So that was my first web application that I ever worked on, and so since then my career has been filled with many more. But that's when UX and specifically application design became a focus of my career. So anyway, that's a little bit about my background. Now about about the book. Now I manage the design team at Batovi, and we are a consulting company. And I think over the years, as I kind of looked back on my career, I realized there were times when projects went really well, and when I felt like I succeeded at building the thing that we wanted to build. And there were times when they didn't, and I was trying to kind of synthesize all of that and think about what went well and why, and how could we do better and kind of create a model that would maybe make that reproducible. And I realized that the ability for designers on my own team, and for myself to be able to communicate and help someone else understand your design decisions in a way that is compelling and convincing and effective, that oftentimes that was the key differentiator in designers who were successful on my team, as well as in projects that were or were not successful. It had as much to do with our ability to communicate about the project as it did the innovation or the effectiveness of what we actually created. Oh, and I guess I didn't explain how I got to the book. Eventually, I gave a talk at some conferences on this topic. So initially, the content started out as a conference talk, and at one of the conferences where I spoke, O'Reilly was a sponsor, and they were there, and my editor was in the room, and they approached me and asked me if I'd consider putting it into a book. So that's how it became a book. And so then the process gets more complicated, because then it's like, well, how do you take like a 30-minute talk and expand on it and look for the details that are missing, and really try to make it something that's practical for people to take home and do on a daily basis. And that's what I tried to do with the book. I tried to keep it very, very practical so that it was approachable and you could read it and pick it up and immediately have a handful of things that you could put into practice tomorrow, or today.
Wow, I think my biggest takeaway from that was that's how you get an O'Reilly book. That's how you get an O'Reilly book deal. So be really good at conferences and have editors in the room, right?
Right. Yeah. There's definitely a sense of just like right place at the right time, and meeting the right people. But I mean, for me, I guess I would walk that back a little bit and be like, being a part of the community in which we work, and contributing ideas freely and trying to help other people ultimately is what leads to those opportunities. That very specifically translated into speaking at a conference where O'Reilly was. But I think the approach is kind of the open source sharing model of wanting. We all need to be better at these skills, and I think having that approach is really beneficial. So.
Yeah, no, I know. Congratulations, and I've actually read your book because you. That's how I know you. You spoke at my company, and I got a signed book, so thank you.
Yeah.
And so I guess designers are in this very unique position where they're kind of they get to kind of hop around, and they see all the different development teams. So while developers or QA engineers might be focused on really their one piece of work or their one slice of a project, designers are kind of have a little bit more flex, and it feels like that's kind of maybe what led you to have this unique ability to kind of observe, right? And it's through a lot of observation that you say, okay, well, this is what works and this is what doesn't, right? Yeah. So I think can we maybe start with one of your biggest observations, which is the CEO button. So can you tell us what the CEO button is and how we can avoid it?
Sure. Well, the CEO button is just kind of this funny tongue-in-cheek thing that I made up, and I define it as an unusual or otherwise unexpected request from an executive to add a feature that completely destroys the balance of a project and undermines the very purpose of a designer's or developer's existence. And whenever I talk about that in conferences or in corporate trainings, it always gets a big laugh, because we've all had the experience, right, of someone who doesn't have the technical or visual background that we do, coming into our meetings and kind of making these blanket decisions that we feel like are really disruptive to the process, and that we probably disagree with. Well, you've probably heard it referred to as like the swoop and poop is one of them, and the hippo is another, which is like the highest highest paid person in the room or something. It's an acronym for that. I personally am not. It doesn't seem like a positive approach to call our stakeholders and managers hippos or to talk about their poop. So that's why I prefer to go with the CEO button. But the point is, it's common sentiment. Like everyone kind of has been in that situation.
Yeah, absolutely everybody. Like, you just made me so happy with those words because you're right. Everybody has had to deal with that and at some point in time, and it can be extraordinarily frustrating.
Yeah. It can, and so I think latching onto that and I think that's one of the reasons why the topic of the book and even just the title, articulating design decisions, has been successful, because people can point to that and go, yes, I know that, I've been there, I see that problem, and so everyone can relate. And I think anytime you have a thing like that where everyone is kind of nodding their head, going, yes, this is a problem, help me solve it, then you end up in a unique position of like I did, of being able to kind of figure out, well, how can we solve it and how can we avoid it? So, yeah.
So, why do you think it happens? With something that is so prevalent that, as we were just talking about, it's very easy for many people to identify with, why do things like that happen? And are there ways that you can either prevent them from happening, or how do you address them when those things do come up? I know that's probably a very large question, but
yeah, well, and so there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, there are a number of reasons why things like the CEO button happens. So if we're talking specifically about executives or managers, then I think the most common explanation is that we have kind of feet on the ground. The designers and developers are kind of the ones building the app, and they've talked to users, and they know the use cases, and they're looking at the backlog and kind of trying to figure out on a daily basis what needs to be built. And so I think the perception ends up being that this executive or this manager is just simply out of touch, right? They just don't have the same perspective that we do on the project. And it's true, they don't have the same perspective. I think the problem is when we perceive it as being purely out of touch. And so a lot of times what can happen in my experience is that if someone is going to come, someone in authority, the person who is probably writing our checks or at least funding the project, even if it's just internally or whatever, there's someone who is kind of in charge. If they're coming in and saying, hold on, back to the drawing board, or no, I don't trust the expertise of my team, because sometimes that's what it boils down to as well, right? I know that's how it makes us feel, right, that we're not being trusted. If someone's coming in and doing that, I think we have to assume that there is probably a valid reason. There may not always be. Some people are unreasonable, and they just kind of want what they want, no matter what we say. And I talk about that in the book too, but I think for the most part we have to assume that there's some underlying reason why they're coming to us with this change, or with this new feature, or with this new addition. And often we either fight against that because we disagree with them, and it becomes literally a fight, or we just say, okay, whatever, we'll do it, and we add it to the list, and now we have tech debt, and we refactor things, and before you know it, it's this monster of a widget. And what we really need to be doing is we need to be asking better questions. We need to get to the bottom of their thinking, because sometimes they may not have a well-justified reason for why they're coming into that. And if we can help them see that and how it affects our project, then they may back off of that. But if they don't, I think there's an opportunity to realize, okay, well, if we have established goals in the beginning of our project, we know what we're chasing after, we know what we're trying to build, and someone is still coming in and saying, no, we're not going to build that thing, we're going to build this thing instead. That's an opportunity to go, okay, hang on, let's take a step back. I think we have a misunderstanding. I think we're not focusing on the right things. It seems like your priority is different than ours, and so we need to get in alignment again. And unless we do that, then yeah, we're just going to feel frustrated.
So you're saying that the CEO button, or the symbolism of it, is kind of really, it speaks to a disconnect, right? So it's a disconnect between really project priorities and or customer needs, right? And so
yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective. And so, and I think you suggested building kind of empathy as well, right? Like, and building and asking more questions and digging in and seeing, okay, well, why, and maybe it is something that's really important and it can be better designed because of that. But you're right. I think without building that empathy, there's no way to really begin to communicate, right?
Yeah, and that word empathy, I think, is really important because it has become sort of a buzzword, especially in UX right now, where, oh, if we could just have more empathy for our users and the people that are using our products, then we'll build better things. And that's absolutely true, I think. But we fail to have that same level of empathy for our stakeholders. And the reality is, it doesn't matter how much empathy you have for the user. If you don't empathize with your stakeholders' position, then your project is never gonna see the light of day. What good is it to have a product that solves the problem for other people if a manager has the authority to come in and shut it down, and then no one ever gets to see it? Like, we get so excited about changing the world with our stuff, but it's not going to have that opportunity if we can't convince the people who hold the keys that our decisions are sound.
And you mentioned this before, but it is very difficult sometimes for those discussions that you're trying to have to not turn into arguments. Right?
Right.
And I think, and there is a fine line there, because eventually, because people can get, people are people. People get defensive, and they will, if they feel like you're just attacking whatever it is they're doing, and this is from either side of it, right? So like this is,
Yeah.
so if a stakeholder comes in and then the design and the development team feel like like all of their ideas or decisions or whatever are being attacked or ignored or something like that, you get very defensive about it, and then it becomes even harder to actually come to what the correct decision is that's going to make everybody happy.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, that was it for me. Please elaborate.
No, I was going to jump on that word that you were using there. The and now I forgot it. But you were where you were headed with this was that it's as much about I think a state of mind and kind of just your viewpoint on what these conversations are supposed to be about, and that's absolutely a critical piece. It's amazing how if we just kind of change our attitude about why we're here, then suddenly we have a different perspective on what it means to talk to another person about our designs. We do get defensive. We see our work. We poured time and energy into it, and we stayed up late, and we tried to get this thing ready, and then we show it the next day, and someone's like, "Oh, this is terrible. This is not what I asked you to do," right? And then you just feel defeated, like you wasted your time. And I think if we see ourselves in these positions to receive feedback, then that's part of the problem, because what we're actually there to do is to facilitate a conversation. And when you see yourself more as a facilitator and less of a recipient, then it becomes a lot easier to kind of give up your control over that, to check that ego at the door and to recognize that there's something bigger going on here. It's not just about me. It's not even just about these users, but it's about the stakeholder is involved too, right? They're a part of this process. It's about the company, and it's about the part. There's so much more at stake than just than the one important detail that we're focused on. And just flipping that mental switch in your mind can make a big difference.
Not having an us versus them mentality will make everything, and I'm not saying that's easy. I'm not saying that's just like, oh yeah, of course we're all in this together, everything is fine. It can be very difficult at times, especially if you have some fundamental disagreements about things.
Yeah,
But
absolutely. Yeah, and I think being able to figure out what that common ground is and point to that as the thing. In the book, I talk about appealing to a nobler motive, which is actually one of the steps of communication from Dale Carnegie's classic book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. And I think that anytime you can appeal to something that is kind of above yourself and even above that other stakeholder, you're going to make it more likely that they'll kind of understand the context in which we're speaking, that you can go, okay, our goal for this sprint is to improve conversion. Whatever it is, whatever that bigger goal is, the thing that everyone is chasing after, we're headed towards this MVP. You have to keep your eyes on the prize, and I'm going to throw out lots of like a bumper sticker kind of things here, but the point is to like remind everybody that we're all on the same team, we're all on the same page, we're headed in the same direction. Even if we disagree about this one specific solution, we're all trying to solve the same problem in different ways. And so how can we work together to arrive at that solution?
Sorry, I was muted. But yeah, that's really great, Tom. And so basically, being on finding that common denominator, right, is kind of what you're speaking to as well. And so I have maybe a difficult question, but as a developer, there are I'm often in rooms with really smart people, and and I see this on my team, I see this in other teams, but when you have, I would say, a higher than average like intelligence level, and that number is times X, I think maybe greater than 4 people, it kind of like dynamics immediately shift. And I see this a lot when you have like tech leads talking to other tech leads. I've seen this, there's like this battle of the smarts, right? And so, so how can teams kind of like funnel that energy, and I think that like that competitiveness, which I think is healthy to some degree, and really funnel it towards collaboration and not I think my way is better or your way is better, right? And I see that a lot with engineering teams, and I'm sure that happens in design as well.
Yeah, and so I think that the approach to what you described may be somewhat slightly different for a design team than it would be for an engineering team. Um, I am not necessarily on the side of the fence that believes that collaboration is like the end all be all of like teamwork. In the book I say teamwork always ends with work, because it's really hard to work with other people, and it's really hard to believe. I mean, if you have the philosophy that everyone should be able to kind of have their say, and we should all be able to collaborate and arrive at this beautiful solution, and then give each other hugs and walk out of the room with rainbows, it doesn't happen in practice. And I know, at least on the design side of things, I try to encourage a lot of our clients to just make sure you always have someone who is ultimately the lead. That, yeah, of course, we can talk about best practices, and we can each kind of like make our case for what we think the right decision is. But at the end of the day, someone just has to decide, and we have to move on. And the only time that that's really a problem, I think, is when you continue to have those egos of people who are like, oh, this is crap. I don't want to write the application that way, or and developers in particular can get really hung up on camel case and architecture and folder structures, and I've been on those projects too, where we spent more time discussing where to put how to organize our components than anything else, right? And that can be and that's not the goal of the project, right? And so then again, you have to really like focus on what's important, and I think those things are just a huge those things can be a huge distraction. So for me personally, I always want to be sure that we know, okay, well, who is the decision maker? Who is going to come in and be able to just kind of break those ties and say, okay, listen, that's a really good point. I appreciate that. For the sake of moving on, here's what we're going to do, and let's move on to the next thing so that we can actually get stuff done.
Because eventually you have to ship, right? Eventually you have to ship a thing.
Yeah.
So one thing that I think is pretty interesting, based on a lot of what we've been talking about so far, is that when we've been talking about design, we haven't really defined what it is, and it's kind of fit very nicely into whether or not you have to defend a certain user experience or visual design decision or a technical design decision. Like a lot of it has you can kind of use it, and you can kind of put yourself in the different situations, because I too, I've been part of those same types of things, right? Where it's a bunch of people in a room yelling at each other about sometimes fairly trivial technical design things, but I'm sure it also happens on the design side of it. So one thing that I'm curious about is we talked about the CEO button and kind of that and that level, and so I kind of wanted to move down the food chain a little bit, as it were, and when you do have to steal in the title of your book, but if you do have to articulate a design decision to a CEO, or stakeholder, we'll call whoever that may be, because it's not always a CEO, so whoever they are. Is there a difference when you have to articulate a decision to taking the consulting model to an external, to the client who you're trying to deliver something to the the internal stakeholder that is maybe that one point, and then one step further down to say the tech lead, for example. So like on that same level, so like the design team, if you design team and tech team, but both on that same level, are there different tactics that you have to employ when you are going about trying to articulate these design decisions?
So I don't think it makes a difference whether it's an internal team or whether it's a consulting relationship from the outside, kind of coming to a company and making recommendations. I don't think that the approaches are any different based on that. It is true that people's roles affect how they view the project and how they view the decisions. And so one of the key skills to learn to have is to how to appeal to someone else's needs when you're presenting your decisions. And everybody is going to have different needs. And in the book, I actually create kind of some personas of different common roles on teams, like developers and managers and product owners and CEOs and stuff. And I kind of walk through, well, and we could do this. You could do it for your own team too, where you just kind of look around the room and you kind of make a short list of like, okay, well, what does this engineer value? What do I know that they value, and how can I position my case to make sure that I'm meeting their needs? Ultimately, I mean, that's what a lot of this boils down to, is that when someone objects to a decision, it's because that decision isn't meeting their needs. And so if we can frame our case in a way that makes sense to them, by addressing their needs, then we'll make a much stronger case. And so there's 3 questions actually that I recommend you be able to answer about like every design decision you make. And those 3 questions are: 1, what problem does this solve? 2, how does it affect the user? And then 3, why is it better than the alternative? And that those 3 questions sort of form the foundation for any discussion that you would have about a design decision, probably whether it's an architectural design decision or whether it's a visual design decision. And in this case, the second question, how does it affect the user? That user could be, in this particular case, it could be especially with, I think, with an engineering decision, it could be the developers, right? Because they're the ones that are going to be using the system in terms of how those decisions affect them. So if you're able to articulate to someone the problem you're solving with this decision, how it's going to affect them, or how it's going to affect the people that are using that, that are affected by that decision, and then why it's better than the alternate solutions, then you're going to make a much stronger case. And a lot of times when we try to identify, well, what problem are we actually solving by choosing by choosing this particular trivial thing over another, there may not be a real problem to solve. And then it becomes more about subjectivity. And so then when you try to dig into, well, why do you prefer it this way? Well, that's what I'm used to. I'm used to having my application architected in this way. And so then you're like, okay, well, what are other ways we can solve that problem for you then? How can we make it easier for you to work within this other architecture that you're not familiar with? Because sometimes that's what it boils down to. It's like it's ease of use. They're not comfortable with the decision because they're afraid they won't be able to write code as fast, right? And so if we can get to the root of the problem so that we can solve that problem for the person, then they'll be more likely, I think, to agree with our decisions.
Yeah, that was actually really nifty, because I think those 3 questions also, like you said earlier, I think they focus the priorities, right? So it kind of it brings together the shared commonality, like what are we actually trying to achieve here, right? And so let's focus on that as opposed to kind of personal preferences and like you said, and maybe even just unintended prejudice, right? So that's really cool. And so how do people, ultimately, disagreements happen, and so really what's the difference between, while you're defending you're answering these 3 questions, how can you avoid getting too defensive? So is there a difference between defending and articulating design decisions?
There is, yeah, and I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, making that mental switch of realizing that you're not there to defend yourself, you're there to make a compelling case, right? It's the difference between being defensive is kind of has a negative connotation, and so I would want to avoid the feeling that I have to defend anything. And instead, I want to have this mental model of being able to bring other people over to my way of thinking. And I think that's a much more positive way of thinking about how we're trying to communicate.
Yeah, and one of my favorite takeaways from the book, as well as actually your talk, was, start everything with a yes, right? So ultimately, it's about leading the conversation forward as opposed to, so it's about building on all the other people's ideas as opposed to just kind of negating them and saying yours are better. And so, can you maybe elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, I think most people have probably heard of the concept of the yes and I in the book I call it leading with a yes, and that is that like when you're preparing to respond, the first word out of your mouth literally should be the word yes. And sometimes people will tell me after I say that, well, I don't really like to start with the word yes. I just like to be positive. No, literally the first word out of your mouth needs to be the word yes, because no one likes to hear no, and yes is a positive, like life-giving word that can literally work magic in your conversations. I know that you were probably taught growing up that the please is the magic word, but it's actually yes. And I think that, and I get more great feedback from people about this section of the book than probably anything else, where people will tell me, man, I went into a meeting and I led with a yes, and I couldn't believe the difference that it made in everybody. Because half the time, people just want to be heard. They want to know that what they said was valuable. They don't want to have the sense that we're just discarding their expertise or their opinions. And if you just make them feel good about what they said, that I listened to you, and yeah, thank you for sharing that. That was a really interesting perspective. And so there are a dozen ways you can lead with a yes, even if you disagree with what they're saying. So if someone proposes what you consider to be a terrible idea, you can still lead with a yes by saying, yes, I completely agree that we need to solve this problem together. Right, and you're automatically just kind of starting off on the right foot. You're pointing out the areas in which you do agree before you get to the part where you don't agree. And I mean, I see this on my own team sometimes too, where you'll provide feedback to somebody, and the first thing that they'll say is, "Oh, well, the reason we did it this way is because," and they start listing off all kind of that. And even if they're making a logical case, even if the things that they're saying make sense, um, it just feels like they're completely disregarding everything I just said. It just feels like they're oh yeah, forget everything you just said. Let me tell you my thing. And you can't do that. You have to be sure that people know that they were heard, and they'll be more likely to agree with you or to move forward with your solution, even if they disagree with you, just because you allowed them to speak their mind and to be listened to.
Yeah, and I mean that's yes, that is such a great point.
See? There you go.
You see what I did? I think just one more quick tip. I found this so helpful. I'm very guilty of like interrupting, so which is bad. I'm like working on it. But I think one of your suggestions in the book was about pausing, right? So when you're listening or when you're talking to people, and you have this idea and you're like, oh my God, I'm jumping out of my seat. I can't wait to share it. Just like let them finish their thought and pause, because if you speak too soon, it's obvious that you were probably too busy articulating your response without fully listening to theirs. And
That's right.
so maybe can you maybe elaborate on that?
Yeah, in the book I call this the art of the pause, because there really is a bit of an art to being able to live in the discomfort of the silence for just maybe 2 or 3 seconds. But yeah, you're absolutely right. What I say is that just when you think they're done talking, just pause for a couple of seconds. And it does a number of things. The first one is that it gives them the opportunity to stop and restart, because sometimes people will think of a better way to explain what they want to say to you. And believe me, if there is a better way for them to explain it that's going to help you understand where they're going, you want to hear it, right? Because you want to be sure that there's no misunderstanding. It also gives them the sense that they were really listened to, as you noted, because you're not just jumping directly into that defensive posture. You're actually taking a second to kind of process what they thought. It gives them the sense that what they said was so valuable that you actually need to kind of think about it for a second. And but then the final thing is that it actually gives your brain kind of time to catch up. And 2 seconds is an eternity for your brain. The speed at which our brains can process information, 2 seconds will actually make a huge difference in your ability to organize your thoughts into a more coherent response. So it's amazing kind of the difference that just those couple of seconds will make. And if it's really, if the silence is really too deafening for you, you can try to make some sort of transition by saying something like, let me think about that for just a second, right? Or yeah, that's a really good point. Let me kind of put together my thoughts on that for just a minute. I do all my meetings just like this over Hangouts or on a conference call, and so sometimes the natural internets of the natural delay of the internet, sorry, make people think that like there's something wrong. Like when I pause, they're like, Tom, are you still there? Hello? I'm like, yeah, I'm here. I'm just thinking about that for a minute because I thought you made some really valid points there, and I want to be sure that I'm addressing them appropriately. That makes people feel really, really good about what you're about to say.
Yeah, that sounds like a great emo band, huh? Internets of Delay.
Internets of Delay. Yeah.
No, I like it. I actually think that's I think little tips like that are really interesting. Things like start whatever you're going to say with yes. Take just 2 seconds to pause, and you don't just blurt something out immediately. And I'm the same way with sometimes, especially if it's something where I'm like, no, of course you're wrong, and this is why you're wrong. And you spend more time formulating your argument than trying to listen. But so now with that, so say you have to deal with somebody maybe like me where I am maybe I'm being a bit combative about something.
Maybe this is purely hypothetical.
Purely hypothetical. Nobody that's ever worked with me would ever say this about me at all. It's all totally fine. But so so we'll pretend that I'm being combative about something that doesn't matter. The point is that I'm being combative about something that is very, very trivial. How do you deal with somebody like me in a way that is still going to be that's not just Danny, shut up and go sit over there for a minute, but it's still it still keeps moving it forward, right? So to get out of the whatever rut it is, where I think the buttons should be X color, something like that. Are there ways of trying to help deal with a person like that?
Yeah, and one of those we sort of touched on earlier, which is appealing to a nobler motive and kind of pointing back at the goals or the purpose of the meeting at hand, and going, hey, Danny, I think it's really cool that you're interested in the design of this particular button. That's actually not what we came to talk about today. We're here to focus on this widget, and we got to leave this meeting with a decision on ABC. But cool, I'll note that, and we'll pick that up next time, or we'll put that in the backlog, or we will be sure that we address that another time. And sometimes, and there's a whole section in the book on taking notes and how important that is to the process of communicating to people, because when you're taking notes, writing things down or typing them on your computer especially, and you want to be sure that your notes are accessible, like in a Google Doc or some sort of shared folder where everyone can see it. Maybe your notes are even up on the screen, so everyone is like watching you type. If you're the kind of the presenter, I want to make you feel good about what you said by writing it down. And there is something more permanent about putting it in my notes, because now all of a sudden, not only did I not discount what you said by leading with a yes and saying, yeah, that's a really good point. It could be blue. Okay, sure. It's not why we're here, but I'm happy to consider that. Let me write that down for you so that we don't forget it. That carries a lot of weight and value, because now Danny is thinking, oh, wow, cool, okay, he valued my thoughts enough to write it down, and I trust that it's not going to disappear into the vortex of the internet. It's going to live there for a while. And you know what? It might actually not come up at the next meeting. But I validated what you said, and I promised you that I would follow up, and I will, But it may be that that follow-up is to come back to you and be like, hey, you know what? I went back to the team and we talked about it, and here's here's the reasons 1, 2, 3 why we think it doesn't work to make that button blue. Here's the problem that it solves by having it red. Here's how it affects the user, and here's why we think it's better than blue. And you may not still buy it. You may still disagree, and that's okay. But hopefully there's some sort of chain of command that kind of allows us to make decisions and move on. But sometimes when someone is really being kind of distracting in a meeting, writing it down, it helps them to feel like it's not just going to disappear.
Good advice.
That's really great advice. That's what backlogs are for, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, no, totally. So I have a burning question, kind of just moving more back into design and kind of really towards maybe some trends that you might be seeing as someone with as much experience as you do in UX. So the web is moving obviously towards modularization and componentization, and so as frameworks, front-end frameworks, even Android at this now is moving towards more of a modular pattern for everything and having more reuse. Are we seeing that same trend in design?
Yeah, absolutely. And in some ways, design has already been there for a little while, because we have always kind of had this concept of using and reusing design patterns, especially in UX, because the user needs to know what to expect. And so we use this certain kind of menu in context A. And so when they get to context B, we want to use the same kind of menu. It may have some visual differences, or it may have different content, but we want to reuse that pattern in a different place because it meets their expectations. They know how to use it. The muscle memory allows their thumbs to tap on it in just the right way, right? And so designers have been kind of trying to take advantage of those patterns for a long time. And so you're right. Now you're seeing a lot of that in development, and I think it overlays really nicely with how UX designers probably are already thinking about some of these things. And so it's become beneficial in our own business, because now we can build these web components in such a way that they're reusable, and it makes the designer's job easier, because now we kind of have this set number of patterns that we can reuse, and it makes the developer's job easier because now we're extending components for use in a different context, as opposed to just duplicating effort. So yeah, it absolutely it has huge advantages.
Do you think it makes things like different design ideologies, like atomic design or stuff like that, easier to translate from design thinking to actual code on the quote-unquote page?
Yeah, it does, and atomic design is a nice example of that. We follow a pattern that at Bitovi that we call style guide driven development. And because we're a JavaScript shop and everything we build is done in the client, and it's all component based, custom HTML components, our design team then has been trying to figure out, okay, well, how do we sort of make this transition from designing in a tool, wireframing or prototyping tool that's like completely separated from the implementation, to bridging that gap to the implementation, because we've got all this great documentation about what the different states of the buttons are and what they should look like, and we define those patterns in a different tool, but then when it comes to implementing them, we don't want to lose that documentation, because that's a really critical piece of helping developers know how to use the application, and even helping designers, and for us, our designers write HTML and CSS and Sass and Less and stuff, so they're getting their hands dirty in the application as well. And so we have a tool that we use called Document.js that basically parses the comment blocks from HTML and CSS and JavaScript and Markdown and whatever, and generates a static site from those comments. So the developers can document the APIs and their components and everything in their comments in their code, and the designers can document all the CSS, each individual widget. So you've got a buttons.less file, and you're putting a comment block at the top of it with a link to a demo that shows the buttons in action, and so now we're generating what we call a live style guide, so that when the application gets built and the static site gets generated, then now we have a place where both designers and developers can go to both see those patterns and how they're implemented in the application, as well as technical documentation. And so now we have one place, and our designers then use that as a basis, so that we're not just implementing stuff in a black box, off in a separate. We're not separating ourselves from the development effort. We're ingrained in it, and we're generating our components in the style guide and making sure that it looks good in the generic context, as well as in the specific context in the application. On the cart page, when someone is logged in, that's exactly what it looks like, but I can also check it in the style guide and know that when I pass a different option to it or a different array of data, then it changes it, and we're constantly switching back and forth between those two to make sure that it looks good. So
that is so cool, Tom. Is that proprietary software or open source?
Well, so
and if it's proprietary, what do I need to do to convince you to open source it?
Yeah, no, everything that we make is open source, free open source.
Awesome. I'm so glad to hear that. I'll have to check that out. I think, and then just, and you can add QA into that, right? I mean, they can build their test cases and all,
yes,
all those assertions off of that. And so, yeah, that's a really fantastic way to really work in a very congruent pattern with design, engineering, and QA, and product too, right? So that's very cool. So I will ask the closing question. I guess it's just leading us into maybe the mothership of style guides. And so, what do you think of material design? What are your thoughts on material? And how it can, and how, it's kind of framing the web in a way, right? Because if you have an Android, everything's already material. So
ultimately, something like material design is a tool, and for right now, it's a tool that makes it easier for other people, organizations to be able to build, applications quickly. It's a framework of design thinking, so that teams don't have to build that stuff from scratch, right? We don't have to think about what the rules should be about these buttons. We just kind of already know. Google has already defined that for us. So in that sense, just like any other framework, it's based on one team's or one creator's kind of ideas and suggestions and best practices at that time and in that context. And I think it will change. I think that it's absolutely a fantastic tool, but it's also prone to the whims and trends of the general population, as well as our own teams and how we decide to build stuff. And I think it's great that we have so many different kinds of design thinking frameworks like material design available to us, but I don't think there's anything inherent in material design that is any more special, or that would. In other words, I think it's a design language that is very valuable and useful, but it's also just a tool. And I'm glad that we have it, but it's nothing more than a tool. It certainly doesn't replace, and I guess this is maybe the danger, certainly doesn't replace the need to have a designer or someone thinking about the use of it. What I see happening a lot with design languages and frameworks is organizations that believe that they don't need a designer, that instead they just need to use, well, if we could just follow the rules of material design, right? You're still not creating you can still create a terrible experience of following everything that the material design guidelines provide. So.
I think that was the I don't know if we want to call that like the bootstrap condition or something like that, but I think bootstrap was one of the first places I started to see that type of thing, right?
Yes.
They were just like, okay, we're just we're just going to use bootstrap. And some people, I also remember hearing something. It's like, oh well, we need to make our app responsive. Oh, we'll just use bootstrap, and that's where that conversation would end.
Yeah, well, and material design takes it a step further because it's more than just a skin, right? They actually kind of go into the details of why we do things and what we should do and best practice. There's more meat to it than just the skin that Bootstrap provides. But you're right. It's a similar problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. I mean, well, that's a really great closing thought. And so designers are irreplaceable. Buy them chocolate. Give them hugs. they take a lot of slack.
And I'm not biased in any way at all.
No, no, not at all, not at
Yeah.
all. No, no, I love my designers. I don't know what I would do without them. So, no, thank you so much, Tom. So,
Yeah, thank you guys. I appreciate your time, and it was fun to chat.
yeah,
Yeah.
any last parting words of wisdom
No,
for?
one of my favorite things really is for people to read the book and tell me and give me feedback. I love hearing from people that read the book and send me stories of successes and failures both. I get all kinds. So definitely, follow me on Twitter and send me a message or LinkedIn or email me tom@batovi.com. I love to hear from people about how this is helping them and what works and what doesn't. So.
That's perfect. And your book is available on Amazon. Just to remind everybody, there's a link to it in the show notes. The title of the book is the same as the title of this episode, Articulating Design Decisions. So, Tom, like Amel said, thank you very, very much for coming on. I think this was really, really interesting. We don't always go into a lot of the design stuff, so it's these types of things because, again, these are problems that many, many people can relate to.
Yeah.
So. All right. So, and with that, this was episode 103 of the Web Platform Podcast, and we will talk to everybody next week. Goodbye.
Bye.